I'll just introduce myself. My name is Andy Senesac. I recently retired from full-time work at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County. Um, and I've started back doing part-time work until they hire a replacement. Next, please.
Are you seeing the note slide or the full?
I'm seeing the full slide.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah, there we go. So I think we'll just quickly go through this. Why don't you just go through quickly the next 5 slides? Okay, so this is good. And actually, the text is going to come every time you hit the return. So the main thing that I learned when I came down here, other than we have such a diverse horticulture and agriculture, is that the soils, even though they're great for growing, are sitting on top of pretty much pure sand, which leads right down into the aquifer. And that presents lots of problems in terms of the use of agrochemicals. Next, please. So I knew when I started that with such a diverse horticulture and agriculture and potential issues with groundwater, that I needed to try to approach my job as in as a IPM fashion as possible, meaning trying to grab and use all of the tools that are available. Next, please. So I want to just review some of the things that I have done over the years, looking at using some of these tools, IPM tools. The first one was weed identification. So one thing that early on, we were getting lots of questions about weed identification. And I thought, well, we have a nice opportunity here to have a permanent weed ID garden. So that's what we did in the early 1990s. Next, please. We put the holes in the ground first, and then laid the landscape fabric over that, and then put using a soldering iron, put the holes where the pots were. That allowed us to seal when we put the pots in. Next slide, please. It created a nice seal, and then so the pots were. There were two. There was a liner and then a second one on top, which had the medium, the soil media, and that way we were able to hook up the drip irrigation and just hook it up to a regular faucet and a timer. Next, please. So over the course of a few years, we actually had three different weed gardens throughout Suffolk County. The large one was at the Long Island Research and Horticultural Facility in Riverhead. And as we were getting more and more into invasive issues, we built this a mobile unit that we could bring to different venues and have the top 40 invasive species on display. Next, please. Next. So moving on to biocontrol, just a couple of things about biocontrol. We have not had much success using plant disease for biocontrol of weeds, even though we've been looking, for any kind of disease weeds that we ever can find. An example of that is a rust disease that has affected lots of common groundsel, and it was inadvertently introduced from the UK a number of years ago. But the problem is that even though it makes the weed look really, really bad, it never really kills the weed and doesn't do a good job at keeping seed production down. Next, please. Another project that I've been involved in, I didn't start it by any means, was trying to get a small weevil to eat Mila minute weed. And Mila minute weed has become a huge invasive issue, particularly after Hurricane Sandy, where a lot of the seed was brought to Long Island shores from New Jersey. Next, please. Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, there we go. So the project was originally started by Judith Hoff Goldstein in University of Delaware, and she found this small little weevil that does a pretty good job at taking care of this vine if it has enough numbers of weevil are released. And next, please. So then that really ended up being the crux of the problem with this particular combination of weed and weevil. You can see that we had when we were involved in a pilot project where we were allowed to get a great number of weevils for release, at 1,500 to 2,000 at a time. And when we did that, we had really good results in terms of the weevils getting established and eat and starting to chew and consume the vine as it grew. However, once the project moved beyond the pilot stage and the rearing lab had to start charging, that economic cost ended up being a big impediment to success, because we couldn't purchase enough of the weevils to really have them in enough numbers to take the weevil down. I mean, take the vine down. So as it is, once we release weevils, they will get established on their own, and they have pretty much distributed themselves throughout the whole island. It's just that there are not enough of them to really do a good job at taking care of a weed that's called Mila minute, and for a good reason. It grows very fast. So we're unfortunately not had a lot of success with that. Next, please. Okay, just quick information here about a weed scouting program that we started a while ago, and we had 4 large field nurseries that were involved, and we scouted at 2 times of the year, in the spring and in the fall. And basically, we were identifying problem weeds and areas where weed management had been implemented but not been successful. And through this program, we discovered one biotype of groundsel that was totally resistant to the material that was being used, simazine. So they were able to fortunately take care of that problem. And we did find a number of new weeds that we had no idea were even growing in these fields. And so that really did help a lot, both the growers and us. Next, please. Following this trial period of 3 years, we weren't able to transition this into a commercial scouting program, primarily because the managers felt that they were getting enough information from us when they would call us and ask us, for help, which we always would provide, that they didn't need the additional cost of having scouting being done every year. So it just was a combination of economics and expediency, I guess. But I think it was successful in the sense that we were able to get a lot of knowledge about how weeds are growing, and how each nursery has its own fingerprint, and so that I think we probably ended up getting more out of it than the managers in that 3-year period. Next, please. Next. Weed biology. Yeah, so we have been over the years trying to use weed biology studies to get a better knowledge of what some of these weeds are doing in the soil primarily. And so early on, there were two weeds that we were really struggling with that we didn't have a lot of knowledge at that point of how they're growing on Long Island. Next, please. So we conducted a growth analysis study, essentially, of four weeds, and the two that I'll talk about here are the yellow nutsedge and mugwort. And what we did was plant single plants of those at the beginning of the season and kept everything else away from them, all other weeds from growing. And then at 4-week intervals, we carefully excavated each plant and counted and sampled. Next, please. And so for the nutsedge, we found an amazing number of 5,000 to 8,000 new shoots were produced from this single plant that was planted at the beginning of the season. So that shows you how amazingly prolific that weed can be. Mugwort, interestingly enough, even though it was very vigorous, it didn't spread very far from the original plant in that 16-week period. And you can see in this picture where she's holding the foliage that was harvested, and that really didn't move out of that round area. But when we looked at the excavated plants, we saw that the rhizomes were moving laterally very vigorously, and that they were just getting things ready for next season when the new shoots would be coming up in a much larger area. Next, please. And so cultural practices. Okay, so I want to talk about so over the years, we've been trying to get a concept called using living mulches to work for us in a number of different crops. The cover crop that we've been working with mostly is subterranean clover or subclover. And the concept is to use a cover crop in an established crop, but use one that has a winter annual life cycle. In other words, that it starts to germinate in the fall, goes through the winter, and then flowers and sets seeds in the spring. And then following that, the seeds will lie dormant and the plant will just die during the summertime. So it doesn't present a lot of competition to the crop. And so unlike, for instance, Dutch white clover, which is a perennial, that never does go dormant. And it can be quite competitive with perennial crops. So the subclover, on the other hand, once the seeds are produced, the above ground part dies back for the summertime. And then as the fall starts, those little seeds will start to germinate right through the mulch, and new plants will get established. So it's a self-perpetuating kind of perennial system, but the plant itself is a winter annual. So it seemed like that was a great way to deal with this, and maybe get something going with the subterranean clover. Next, please. But and I'll get into why that didn't work. So the other one, more recently, the other species that we've been looking at is called bulbous bluegrass, and that actually is not it. You can see in the hand that it looks like a inflorescence of seed, but actually those are aerial bulbs or bulbils, and the bulbs, that's what is sold as the cover crop. There was a company out in California that's interested in pursuing this in vineyards, so that's why we started doing this project. The good thing about those bulbs is that once they're seeded, they get established very, very quickly. Within a few days, you have a cover crop started. The bad thing is that it's being a narrow-leaved grass. Even though we seeded it at pretty high rates, up to 500 pounds of seed per acre, you can see in those bottom two pictures that the weed competition is high and potentially high, and it's not able to really do a great job at least in this first year of establishment, at competing with other weeds. And then following the springtime, and in June, the grass starts to brown out, and then will brown out completely during the summertime. So next, please. So we've had two cover crops that we've had limited success with, but I don't think it's time to really give up on the notion of having a living mulch. It's just we don't have all the particulars right yet. You have to have a cover crop that's available and commercially and as competitive during the part time that it grows with weeds, but then is not competitive when it's supposed to be dead, which also it has to be reliably hardy. And this is the big problem that we've had with subterranean clover. Well, it'll do well for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then if we get a really hard winter, or maybe not even that hard, but maybe windy, then we will have a complete cover crop failure the following spring. So that's really been the limiting factor for that one. And the limiting factor for the POA is that it's just not very competitive with the weeds. Next, please. Okay, herbicides. Okay, so I've been working with the herbicide trials through the whole course of my graduate work, and all the time I've been here on Long Island. I've probably conducted more than 700 herbicide trials over the years. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I want to say that, when it comes to herbicides and looking at them in a well-rounded IPM approach, what is my role? Well, I edit the weed management chapters of Cornell's pest management guidelines for woody and herbaceous ornamentals. I co-authored with a colleague of mine, Joe Neal, a fact sheet on alternatives to glyphosate when the whole glyphosate issue came to the fore about 6 or 7 years ago. We had a lot of information about alternatives. We needed some more, but we had a lot. It just hadn't really been written up as a cohesive fact sheet. So we were able to produce that. And I think that's helped some people looking at other ways to manage weeds other than with glyphosate. But even so, even before the whole issue with glyphosate, we've always been looking at alternative softer chemistry herbicides. And in one case, we were looking at something called foam stream, which is steam that's produced and then mixed at the point of it being sprayed with a syrup, an organic syrup that allows the steam to become basically a foam, and it stays on the weed longer than it would if it was just steam. So we had a couple of trials where we were looking at how well it might work on some perennial weeds, and in this case it was mugwort. And you can see that the foam, once it sat there for a little bit, did a really good job at knocking out the above ground part of mugwort. As we know, mugwort is spread by rhizomes. So in order for this to work well, it would have to be redone on a very short basis, every 2 or 3 weeks. And that's probably going to be prohibitively expensive, except in areas which is where we were in a state park where they have, very strict guidelines on what materials can be used. And something like this might be useful, particularly around hardscapes. So, it's got its place and it has potential. We just can't be used everywhere. Next, please. One other thing that we've been doing with herbicide use has been working with the DEC on trying to develop fact sheets for best management practice guidelines for, particularly in my case, I've been working with pre-emergent herbicides that have been found in groundwater, in particular atrazine, simazine, and diclobenyl. So those are the three herbicides, and there are also some fungicides and insecticides that are also being dealt with through cooperation with the DEC. I think on the next slide, please. So even though some of these projects that I've talked about didn't have the outcomes that we had envisioned, particularly the weed scouting program, we did end up getting a great deal of knowledge from that project. And I think I still have use of some of that information. And all the herbicide trials that I've done over the years, it's all kind of grist for the mill of finding out, of just basically building on a knowledge base of allowing me to say, well, really that's not a place for herbicides or for these particular group of herbicides, and maybe we could use another tool to manage other than herbicides. So I think that's really helped me in my knowledge and adapting using a weed IPM approach. Over the years, I've just gained a great deal of some respect for plants that we call weeds, because they just they're never going to go away. And if no matter what weed you might be hot on the trail of this year, there's going to be another one next year that'll be outsmarting us. And I don't know if we have any time. I have one other project I want to talk about, Brian, but if we don't, I can.
Yep. No, there's
Okay.
time.
Okay. So one thing that I've worked with over the years, particularly with crops such as pumpkins, which are planted down here on Long Island as late as late June. So that's a whole period of time between when it warms up in April to June where the weeds want to grow. And so if we can use something like a clear plastic tarp, not the black plastic, but the clear plastic, to really essentially create a mini greenhouse effect during that period from April and May, and get all of the weeds that would normally be germinating over a long period of time to germinate in that short period of time under the plastic. Then we take the plastic off, it can be reused, and then we deal with the weeds that have emerged and plant the crop in there. That little video that we just saw basically just did what I was describing. And it's amazing how much weed growth there was under that clear plastic, because the temperatures were getting much higher than they are outside in April and May. So I mean, there's definitely limitations to this kind of an approach, because it would be more for a crop like say cut flowers, where you have a number of different species that you can plant in a small area. It might be a way to clean up a field and plant the cut flowers without having to really worry about much weed growth to follow it for the rest of the season. I think that's about the last slide, but you could, yep.
Yep, that's the last one. Thank you, Andy. That was a real whirlwind, and
sorry about that.
yeah. No, that was great. No, I really appreciate you coming to speak with us, and it was really nice to hear some of the highlights over your career. And I should have mentioned, Andy officially retired in 2022, but he's been working part-time until they refill the weed science position on Long Island. And yeah, has been doing a fantastic job, and just has a great IPM approach to weed management. So yeah, so we have plenty of time for questions. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions, and then after that, we'll have another 10 minutes if there's folks that, more informally want to stay on and ask, questions or share comments with Andy.
Sure.
So feel free to unmute. But first, let's look at the chat. I think there are a few questions already. Gary Fish asks about the mobile unit for Weed ID. Do you have any plans for that? I'm not sure if he means like what you're gonna do with it, or if he wants to build one.
I want to build one.
Oh,
To build one.
actually, it was an old greenhouse trolley that we used in the between different ranges in the greenhouse, and we got a very clever farm manager who was great with the welder, and he basically adapted it to be able to put the potholes in it. So it was a very bespoke type of project, but you could see from that any kind of thing like that could be figured out depending on what what the cart that you have available is.
Yeah, recently we've been doing invasive plant workshops for the nurseries and greenhouses up here, and one of the challenges was not in every location could we find a lot of the invasive plants. We wanted to show them on location. So if we had something like that, as opposed to just cutting samples and bringing them with us, that would be kind of neat. But
yeah,
great idea.
Yeah, we've ended up not using it as much the last few years, partly because I was approaching retirement, but I found that growing the plants in an outdoor hoop house in like 4-inch pots, square pots, allows us to like put 6 to 12 in a crate and basically bring those to the venue. Usually it's like plant sales or educational moments where they're only going to be there for a few hours. And so having them in these pots makes it a lot easier to throw them in the back of the truck or the back of the car.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
And then there's also a question about high temperatures impacting soil microorganisms, I think both from the foam and also maybe from solarization.
Yeah, that I'm sure that occurs, and whether or not it's a problem or not, I do not know. The soil is an incredibly buffering environment, so getting high temperatures it's very difficult to get high temperatures very deep into soil. But that doesn't mean that even though above normal temperatures might definitely affect the microflora. And if I had funding for that solarization project, most of the projects that I talk about, I actually have done on my own dime. Those are the most fun ones, right? Because you can just do what you want. But if I had more funding for that, I would have been looking at those kinds of issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's been a little bit of work from the University of Maine showing that under solarization for 2-3 weeks with those high temperatures. Oh yeah, and I think Kamara is mentioning that as well. The microbes populations were reduced for a week or so afterwards, especially in the top inch or so, but they did rebound. Yeah, so it seems like they're resistant or resilient to high heat to some extent. Yeah, so other questions from the group? If not, I have a few, but I'll let others go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. First of all, how hot does solarization get the soil?
We don't really know. I can't really answer that.
It's probably really variable.
Yeah.
Okay.
It can get up over like 110, 120.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
That's what they found at Maine.
Yeah. So that's
right.
but how deep does that go? That's the question.
2 or 3 inches. So not that far, but but weed seeds are in that top layer anyways, typically.
Unfortunately, for the weed like mugwort, 3 inches is nothing. It laughs at 3 inches.
Mhm. No, that's what my second question is about. Is mugwort an agricultural weed in Long Island?
Well, it depends on how you define agriculture. In row crop agriculture, not really, no. But we have a lot of vineyards, a lot of field nurseries where it's a huge problem.
I see. That makes more sense. Yeah, I'm more into row crop stuff. My other question was the foam stream that you mentioned. That's new to me. That's interesting. Does the glyphosate not soak in as deep into the soil when you use that kind of method as
No,
opposed to a liquid?
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. I was talking too fast, I guess. That's just water and mixed with the syrup. There's no herbicide in there,
Oh,
and that's why we had permission to do it on a state park property, because they don't allow herbicides to be used, but they were.
so it's just the heat then.
It's
Interesting.
it's amazing how quickly the weeds just melt, and they did stay. That bare ground plot that I showed you, that was pretty clean for another 2 weeks, I'd say. And then we started seeing a lot of shoots, and then you come back mid season, you won't even know that there was a plot there. That's how resilient the weeds are.
Yeah, it's similar. I know people that like to use like big flamethrowers,
Yeah,
and this seems similar, a lot less difficult and a lot less carbon dioxide.
I was going to throw in some slides about the work we've done with weed flaming, but we were trying to adapt a field applicator early on, because that was being used to control the Colorado potato beetle. They were using this like a boom in the back of the tractor to burn off the Colorado potato beetle at a certain time of year, I guess before the potato came up. And then once that project was done, we were trying to see if we could use that as a means of killing the weeds in a stale seedbed setup. And we were able to do it, but it was very dangerous and also expensive to get the propane. So that didn't end up going very far, but it potentially is there. And the handheld the backpack type propane, those have issues too that make me worry about using them personally. We tried doing it on a turf area that had some underlying thatch, and we did one day during the daytime, and that flame is so blue you can't really see it. Apparently, it was going, and we didn't really know it until we started seeing black moving out from the plot. So if you do it during the early morning hours or in the evening, it's easy to see and easy to control. So that would be the recommendation I would have on that one.
Oh, interesting. That's something that my friend wants to do on some acreage he uses for hay. Is there a better recommendation? Because it's a lot of acreage for burning. I think he just wants to burn stuff.
Oh man, I would not recommend that.
I know.
Very-
I told him not to.
Andy, have you met Vipin Kumar, our new weed scientist for field crops based in the Soil and Crop Sciences department section? And sorry to put you on the spot, Vipin. I just wanted to make sure you got to meet each other virtually.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Andy. Thank you for the presentation. It's great work. I had a question. I was just keeping to myself. You mentioned about some of the simazine work or triazine work. I was wondering, like, considering the restrictions we have in Long Island, how the resistance, especially triazine resistance, weeds in that area. How do you know any work been done in understanding some of the resistance among the weed species?
Yes, we did when I started there, back in the 80s. We had very few herbicide options, and those herbicides were being routinely overused and abused, probably would be the word. And so that, I think, is part of why the simazine resistance that we did see with the groundsel came about. And since then, even though Long Island is way behind the rest of the state in terms of materials that we can use, we certainly have more now than we did. And so having different materials to use really helps ameliorate that problem. The other issue I think that really is keeping it from getting more out of hand than it is the fact that it's a very diverse agriculture, and we don't have, I mean, probably the biggest areas that we have of unbroken production would be in the sod fields and maybe vineyards as well. But our biggest, as far as I can tell, our biggest issue right now is an incipient infestation of glyphosate-resistant horseweed, which, and I think most of what we have has blown here from the Midwest or the Eastern. I don't think we're induced it ourselves.
Yeah, that's I think easy to predict. That's those invasive species can jump on. And how about the cover crops? You mentioned some work on cover crops. So how widespread adoptions in that regions, especially in perennial crops or nurseries, people are growing quite a bit of cover crops?
Yes. So the nursery industry has changed a lot in the last 30 years or so. It used to be mostly field production, plants like taxus or yews or shade trees. And that has become less economically feasible than growing those same plants in containers. So there's a lot more container production than there used to be, and also a lot less field production. But because of the high winds that we have down here, it's mandated, I think, by most of the towns that fall cover crops be planted wherever possible.
Okay.
So that's usually winter rye or sometimes oats.
Okay.
But for all of the shade tree production, they have a permanent grass sod between those, and usually a bare ground within the row. Because that allows them to get their equipment on for for no other reason but that.
And you just mentioned about the flaming work you have done. I mean, what were the successes you can tell using a flaming versus now we have these electric weeders folks have been trying in perennial crops?
Right.
So any species specific, those tools in terms of management?
Well, there's certain weeds that we've been trying to shoehorn the use of glyphosate to control the weed, and actually other approaches might be better. And the one that I'm thinking about is Verna Fricaria verna, or the Ranunculus celandine. It's a very bad invasive, but because it's what they call ephemeral, it's only there during the spring months, and it emerges in late March and it's gone by the end of May. But it's been found that if you can make glyphosate applications, 1 or 2, it does a pretty good job at managing it. But glyphosate is definitely not the choice of material that most people want to use. So having some flamer that you can use in a very confined area it would probably work pretty well, because you really are mostly trying to kill the tops.
John, you will see that all over campus in the spring.
Oh, hey, Beth.
I mean, it's just the campus is now just yellow with it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you will definitely notice it. It's in the
Okay.
garden up front of Plant Science. If you walk up and down Tower Road, you will see it, and it's all over town.
Okay. All right.
Badly.
Well, I'm not gonna take all the time, but good to see you, Andy, and thanks, Brian, for the intro.